Namaste, and welcome back to another episode of MSL Lead Chronicles, where leaders learn from leaders. I'm Mary Morton, and along with my buddy Chad Fellers, we have casual talk about the challenges and successes in medical affairs with the most exciting and impactful professionals in pharma. As always, we have another great one for you today, so stick around.
Welcome back to another episode of MSL Lead Chronicles. I'm your host, Chad Fellers, along with my nifty sidekick, Mary Morton. How are you, Mary?
I'm doing terrific. How are you doing today? Yes.
I'm doing good. I'm doing really good. I wish the weather would make up its mind. It's gone from hot to cold, and sort of like it's going through menopause. I'm not real sure, but nevertheless, maybe
I don't
one
think
of the
you're
days
really
it'll
at
make up its
liberty to
mind.
discuss those sorts of things.
It was the royal we, Mary. I was speaking on behalf of us,
Well,
right?
don't talk about me and menopause.
I mean, I don't even know where to go from that. Nevertheless, I guess we ought to get into the actual purpose of our show, which really centers around Mary, if I can, but which I think many of our listeners, that's probably the reason why they dial in. But nevertheless, we will actually have some medical affairs conversations today. And so I'm really excited about today's guest. And he's a good friend of mine, a former colleague. We're going to talk a little bit about navigating a shift from MSL to medical director, just hear his story. And with that, so why don't you introduce our guest, Mary?
I am happy to. So we are welcomed today by Steve Roblin, PhD. He's currently a senior medical director with Alnylam, and he's the medical lead for the transthyretin amyloidosis across the United States, previously Canada. He leads.
You said that so smoothly, Mary. Great job.
Well,
better than I could have said it.
Well, Alnylam's one of my clients, so the number of times I say transthyretin amyloidosis is many. So he's leading the U.S. medical strategy, scientific education, and the cardiology engagement to support their RNAi-based therapies, Nobel Prize-winning science, by the way, for patients who are living with ATTR. He has a career that has spanned multiple companies, not just Alnylam, but he started off as an MSL. He's very passionate about developing and leading high-performing teams and opportunity to accelerate improved care for patients living with rare diseases. Yeah. So welcome to the podcast. We're going to have a little rapid fire question answer so that our audience can get to know you even a little bit better. So the question everybody gets is, what would your walk-up song be?
My walk-up song. Oh, that's great. So we just got through, so I'm Canadian. I mean, I'm sure that'll come up in my story. But we just went through a pretty tough loss with the Blue Jays recently, right? And every single Blue Jays player has a walk-up song. And Davis Snyder, who's one of my favorite players, has Pink Pony Club as his walk-up song. And that's not a song that I would particularly go for, but seeing him walk up to Pink Pony Club and the crowd cheering, I feel like I would take Pink Pony Club. If not, something by Avicii, I would feel like is always a good one. I had that one when I just did a presentation in Madrid 2 or 3 weeks ago, and that kind of gets you going.
Oh yeah, yes, those are his rounds over there.
I don't have a clue on any of those songs. They sound unique, and
Chapel Roan, Pink Pony Club.
I'm sure it would be great. So I will definitely look it up afterward. So thank you for educating me.
The
always
late great
educate me,
Avicii,
Steve.
by the way.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Next question. And this, I may be profiling you because you're Canadian. I may or may not be. Greatest goalie of all time. Is it Martin Brodeur, or is it Grant Fuhr, or is it Tony Esposito?
It's Patrick Waugh.
Patrick Waugh. Okay. Why?
That's a great question. And so I'll give another little clue. And again, there's a lot of stereotyping going on this call. Just because I'm Canadian doesn't mean I'm an extreme hockey fan. I'm actually not a huge hockey fan. Don't tell anyone. Um,
But
Patrick
you did
Ross
manage
just,
to name one of the top 10 best
you know what?
goalies.
I have to keep my cred up just in case I get in the wrong conversation with someone out in the world. Um, just growing up, watching hockey, and that was, he's really a player that, sort of just, again, who knows why the name comes up, just stuck in my mind. Yeah, so that's
He's
it.
a good one. Yeah.
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely.
And then when you go on vacation, do you seek the beach or do you seek the snow?
It depends on the time of year. In the winter, I seek the beach. I'm not going to lie. I'm going to be going to Mexico in a few weeks. The beach is calling me.
Mm,
The sirens of the coast. But in the winter, it is nice to get it skiing, right? So next year we're going to be going to Quebec, go in the mountains, ski. It's great. I love outdoor activity, winter sports, summer sports. Chad knows. We do a lot of extracurricular activities with our family and really see the great outdoors. So it's really exciting.
love it. I
He's
love it.
really,
Okay.
he's really, really versatile, in his experiences. And we'll get to, I think the listeners will get to hear just a little bit,
Mhm.
just kind of about, what makes him so well-rounded in our conversation. So Steve, one of the things we like to do, on our podcast is really start with key takeaways from our guests, just so the listeners can understand what the rest of the show is going to be about in case they have to drop away for a minute or whatnot. So with that, what are your key takeaways for today?
Yeah. If we're talking about shifting from being an MSL to a medical director and that transition, I always think of going from the end to the beginning, right? And thinking about what is it about being a medical director that is sort of an integral part of an MSL, and what sorts of skills can pull you forward, right? So I think one of them is, right, shifting from an execution individual contributor mindset to strategy and enterprise thinking. I mean, that's one that, again, naturally MSLs, I think, do through their day-to-day practice. And we can talk a little bit about that. This idea of influencing and building belief in people is just so important. It's just a life skill. I don't think this is necessarily even confined to MSLs, but that's something that an MSL absolutely has to get completely adept at doing. And that skill really, really helps, as you have to do that to others in a company, and then still externally, sort of as your key goal. And then the third one is just multiplying your own impact through others and scale. This idea of doing more through others, through other opportunities, whether that be colleagues or whether that be out in the world. And you're not just going around from office to office influencing one-on-one. What do you do to do more, better, faster? And all of those things MSLs do, they get better at it. And those are the ones that really, sort of stand up to the plate, and to use another baseball analogy, and can make that transition really be effective.
All right. So, I kind of teased a little bit about what you're doing now, but can you share with our listeners what that career journey kind of looked like?
Yeah, so it's been thinking back a little while. I think both Chad and I have some gray hair. So it's been a while, and I was reflecting before we got on the podcast. It's interesting. A transition only happens once. So there's only one time where I personally transitioned from an MSL to an MSL leader. So that one time is of course unique to me, and everyone's gonna have a little bit of a different journey. So my journey was, I as I mentioned, I'm Canadian. I live in Canada, and I started my career there. And in Canada, we have this really unique thing called maternity leave that goes on for a year, right? And that creates a really big opportunity, which is that we have very capable and talented women leaving the workforce for a year at a time. And because of that, there's sort of a whole industry of bringing in, um, green, sort of new blood into different parts of the career. And that was the way I sort of transitioned from my PhD, which was sitting, under a hood, pipetting cells and all of those sorts of things, to now getting out and having to talk to human beings, and trying to make sure that we're communicating science. So I did that for a few years, and had the opportunity to take that year, and traveled all over the country to different regions, had a lot of responsibility. I actually ended up, really interesting story, I think 6 months in, the manager that I had, incredible visionary leader, but had a very strong Austrian accent. And we were asked to have someone needed to go to Indonesia to give a talk to a group of Indonesian and Indian hematologists. And the one caveat was they have to be able to talk about our science, and they have to have a pretty neutral accent. Now, I'm Canadian, so I don't know how neutral it is. It's close enough. So 6 months into a green MSL, I'm flying to Bali, giving a presentation to a huge group of Indonesian and Indian hematologists. So that was kind of, I guess, a little bit of an example of taking an opportunity, getting thrown in to a very new environment that I wasn't used to, and sort of capitalizing on that opportunity. So that's kind of an example of, I think, starting my journey. And then from there, I was able to sort of take those opportunities and convert them into then leading a team. And, in my particular case, I was at a company that had a pretty small team. I think in Canada, generally the teams are pretty small, which we could talk about, maybe has some advantages and disadvantages, but it was a team of colleagues, right? So then you're going and leading a team of colleagues, and that, for a first-time manager, that's a pretty interesting and challenging transition to do. And there's certainly a lot I learned out of that period of my career. And then, was able to take that and go into a more about strategic leadership position in terms of the medical affairs in general, sort of running the affiliates in Canada for that company, another company. And then was able to sort of parlay that into transitioning to Alnylam, which is at the time was a scrappy biotech starting up in Canada. I was the only person working in the Canadian affiliate, and had an opportunity to build that affiliate and have an incredibly successful launch of our first product ever. And it was an incredible part of my career.
I loved how you said, and it's sort of it's like an aha a little bit, that you only make this transition one time. So, and I think there's so much more underneath that line than people probably realize, because you got to do it right. So in making the switch into the medical strategy side, was that 100% strategic? Like, were you planning and putting yourself in these positions, or did it sort of just come to you?
Just happened. I'd like to say that I thought it all through and I planned it out, and it happened. It happened exactly the way I thought, but that wouldn't be, of course, true. I think it's really this idea of, thinking about preparing yourself for an eventual opportunity that is going to be a little bit fuzzy, right? And because we're in a very dynamic environment, right? Even within one company, you can sort of plot out what I'm going to do in this company. Things happen to companies. There's mergers that happen. Your network that you've built, a lot of relationships can change, and you have to really think about be a little more open-ended, and just sort of, again, take the right sets of opportunities to sort of put yourself in a position. So in terms of strategy, in that role, it was more, I think, the logical transition for me was to go from leading a team to leading, an affiliate part of the organization. And with that came the requirement to have to create and build and execute strategy. So it was a little bit of also learning on the job. I mean, sometimes people give you you're taking an MSL who's really good at, interacting with key opinion leaders, again, creating belief through influence, creating networks and relationships. And part of that is a little bit of osmosis on strategy. But then when you're put in the position to say, okay, build a strategy, there's a lot of learning there. You have to seek mentorship. You have to sort of, I think, embed yourself into situations where you can see how strategy is built, how things are executed, get experience. Don't feel like you have to do it all yourself. And I think I mentioned that multiplying through others, that also reflects back in yourself. You have to multiply your impact through learning and experiencing what others are doing, and not,
Mm.
trying to build things from scratch every time on an island by yourself.
For the listeners, if you didn't pick up on this, one of the things that I love that you just said is it. I hope I'm not misparaphrasing, but um, you continually put yourselves in positions to grow and expand your skill set. It doesn't mean you know specifically where you're going next, but you're going somewhere,
Yeah.
and it's going to be
Yeah.
bigger than it was before.
Absolutely. And I can reflect a little bit. One of the things we have, and I think, Chad, you've interviewed a couple of our fellows on some of your previous podcasts, right? And I think of fellows as almost, they're sort of proto MSLs, right? So it's also the same idea. And this is what we do in our fellowship program, right? Just we map out what are people interested in, what are some opportunities that the business needs, that they need personally as fellows, and then think about what can we do to position them from an experience perspective, from a visibility perspective. So when that time comes for that next opportunity, which sometimes is an MSL, it's a complete no-brainer. And I think is an MSL, that's what you have to do to put yourself in the position where when that opportunity comes, you don't know when it's going to come, you don't know exactly how it's going to come, but when it comes, the person that's making that decision, or the group of people that are making that decision, when your name goes up on the big screen with 10 other names, your name has no brainer written beside it. And people are on board to give you a chance. Because there's always an opportunity to bring someone in that has that experience, right? So to get that level up, someone has to give you a chance, and they have to be confident you're going to take that chance and run with it. And that's a really important thing to really think about and position yourself well for.
So, Steve, backing up real quick, along the line, I think I missed that you were an MSL director. You had transitioned to an MSL director prior to making the switch. With that, how much do you think that? Because the question I was going to ask was thinking about the mindset shift between an MSL into the medical director role, and talking about that. And I know you alluded to that in your key takeaways overarching, but how much do you think being a leader of people helped position you and made that transition more seamless, or did it? And I know you can only transition one time, and you didn't have the other way to do it, so it's hard to really compare apples. But just from your experience, can you think about some of those things, being an MSL and an MSL director, right? And then did that really position you? You feel like that positioned you to be successful in your current role?
Yeah, it's almost like an observational study within a control group. I like it, Chad. Good, very, very medical. So it probably did, just sort of, I think, thinking about why. When you're leading people, you're having to then learn a brand new skill, but you're learning it in a little bit less more of a protected environment, I guess, because you sort of have one focus now, which is kind of what you did by yourself, and now you have to lead other people to sort of do the thing that made you successful, but also sort of in a way that's going to sort of work with them. So there's almost like just one more task on top of an MSL role. So I think that's really helpful. And again, like I said, I learned a lot from that experience of being a new manager of colleagues. And if I had to go back, and I think this is one piece of advice for career moves for anybody, is looking back now, I wish that I had um, taken the opportunity to afford myself of more resources and support, and really making sure that I was thinking about how to do this job well, and not just having the instinct to try to figure it out myself. And I'll tell you, and sometimes you're in a position where people will offer you a lot of resources, and they'll kind of hold your hand, and they'll give you the leadership course, and they'll give you the book on how to manage people, and they'll work with you. And if you have that, fantastic. That's great. You may not always have it. But that doesn't abdicate you from the responsibility of having to then, you still have to do that. And I would just really, if I could go back now, there would be tons of things that, knowing now what I know, I would do. I would look at that person that was managing those people and give them a shake, right? So, and I think I think that kind of adversity and that sort of challenge, I think just helps you in general. And I'm sure it helped me go into my next role and also position you, because you have to, again, other people have to look at you. And when the position comes up for the head of strategy or leader of the department, it has to be, you're still on that no-brainer discussion, and leading and having that extra experience puts you on that no-brainer list.
So, what are some of the things that you were able to easily adapt from leading MSLs to becoming this leader of strategy? And what do you think were the hardest parts, or the more challenging parts, I should say?
Yeah, I think that most challenging part is when it's back to this enterprise level thinking or systems thinking, is like, it's a hammer and nail thing. When you're an MSL, you have a pretty narrow view of what medical affairs even is, especially if you're brand new, right? You come in, you're being trained as an MSL, and you sort of have a certain job, right? And then when you're a leader, your brain expands a little bit more to, okay, I have to think a little outside myself into a team, but you're sort of, again, having them do field work. Your channel is the field. I think when you go up one level higher, it's really, again, being able to say, okay, now my channel isn't just the field. And it's really easy to have a bias towards that channel, right? If that's where you've always been, you're biased towards what do you need to do? Again, if we think of our general job in medical affairs is to take data and then inform belief and practices, then that the field is one channel. It's a very important channel to do that. So you have to then be able to say, how can I understand all the other ways in medical affairs, all of the other channels to communicate our science, and make sure that you're really focusing on those. And if you don't have experience, understanding those really quickly, getting mentorship, taking courses, looking at how the rest of the department is, having a mentor, in those sorts of things. So I think that's just a natural, this again, back to going beyond yourself in your role and having that enterprise level thinking.
You do that really well too. I think that one of the things I've always appreciated about you, Steve, is being able to think outside the box. And while you may have a bent towards a certain direction, I think that you all are more often times than not, you're able to take pause and take a step back in the moment, by the way, and then be able to set aside maybe your preconceived notions, if you will, if they were more limited in nature, and being able to look at that more holistic picture. I'm sure that that's come after years of practice and maybe even failure at certain points about trying to drive it a certain way or not. So there may be learnings there. I think one of the things you also mentioned a second ago in your comment was around, like, I wish I would have learned, or I wish I'd have asked questions. I wish I would have known this, that, and the other. I mean, there are clear manuals that are out there when it comes to MSLing, right? I don't know. I still don't think I've ever seen one for medical director. And so a lot of it is learning on the job in ways. And so that really kind of ties in. I know we say, and it is MSL Lead Chronicles, and the majority is for MSLs, but we have a broad range of listeners as well too. So any kind of things, that's the whole purpose of our show, is to be able to, where leaders can learn from leaders and potentially close those gaps, right, that might be there, so they don't have to walk through the same type of journey in ways. I mean, some of it's healthy and it's going to be natural, but love that you're willing to even share some of those. I would, or if you would too, like some of those key either mishaps or learning on the jobs, or let's even start with this. Any surprises about responsibilities or expectations of a medical director role that you didn't anticipate going into it?
That's a great, no, I love that one. And I think also, just to reflect on the word medical director and what a medical director does is very different at different companies, right? And it depends on a whole bunch of different things. It depends on the life cycle of the company, how medical affairs is kind of viewed in the company. And so those are actually probably the two biggest things. And I'll give a couple examples. So early life cycle company, right? In a very clinically oriented company, maybe the medical director will have the expectation for we'll call it like the high science acumen, right? Protocol design, reviewing protocols, and, really getting into recruitment for clinical trials and working with the clinical team on those very specific sort of development of science and clinical aspects may be very, very high, right? And we'll call it influence and storytelling part of it maybe a little bit less so, right? You flip that and you say you're into a company where a lot of that clinical development stuff has maybe passed, or there's maybe a broader department that takes care of those things. A role of a medical director may be more around, again, operationalizing our scientific narrative and channeling that out at scale, right? Through the field, through digital, through other types of KOL engagements, society engagements, right? Those are very different medical director roles. The capabilities are different. Probably what people are interested in, where they will gravitate towards, is different. So I think that's a really important thing to say. So there's not a one size fits all. So I think it's also really understanding when you're getting into the medical director role for that particular company. What is that role? What are the capabilities? And is that a fit for what you want as an MSL, right? And there's some MSLs that are very, very clinically oriented, again, depending on their experience and their proclivities and maybe, what company they're in. And there's some that are more, we'll call it communication and storytelling oriented. And maybe that fits a different type of medical director role, and you'll have more success in making sure that you're not just jumping into a role that is actually going to be a big disappointment, or is going to be something that you're not interested in.
That's really good advice. I think about oftentimes MSLs will look for the next opportunity, and they'll jump to just for the sake of jumping and doing something different. But with that, let's just go the scientific narrative route that you just mentioned, right? So what do you think the characteristics are needed to be successful in that role, or have made you successful in that role?
Yeah. So in terms of, so scientific narrative, and again, when we say that, what are we really saying, right? And this is this idea of, we have data, right? And data is inherently complex, right? We're talking about clinical studies with lots of endpoints and p-values and supplements. And it's, how do you take all of the data that you have, and how do you compress it and articulate it in a clear scientific narrative? Now, that doesn't mean it's marketing. That doesn't mean it's not credible or it's not comprehensive. It's clear. And again, if we think about what's the role or what's the goal, is to make sure that, the healthcare community has clear information, which is knowledge, to inform appropriate attitudes, to then have best practices to support their patients. That is the role of medical affairs, right? And the more we can cleanly and clearly articulate our scientific narrative to build that knowledge and attitudes, the better the practices will be. So that is something that's just inherently important. And MSL has to do that. We have to do that as a company. We have to do that as medical directors. So I think that's kind of just so everyone sort of gets the idea of what we're talking about. And then how to get good at that. It's very difficult, and there's always places to go and learn. I am not the best at doing that. I still have, as everyone does, a lot of ways to learn. And again, the idea of how do you tell a compelling narrative and a compelling story, right? And there's a number of ways to do it. And I think it's being able to look at best practices, right? Again, bring in others that are good at telling stories and learn from them. One of the things we also do in medical affairs is we engage a lot of external consultancy and agencies, right? And sometimes people can have bad experience with agencies, but they also have a lot of integration of what has worked and what hasn't worked in other companies and in other situations that they can bring to the table. And then you can take your perspective and then articulate it through the work product that they do. So I think that's sort of the how. And then it's iterative. I think, again, another really important part, this is again back to, I'm trying to tie things that MSLs do, is active listening, right? Is getting feedback and then taking that feedback in insights and then making a change. The worst thing that we can do is sit in a room, develop our story, our narrative, our data, and then you know, externalize it and then just pretend that that's great and this is the best thing since sliced bread and everyone will be happy. We have to listen to the community, take feedback, and then make changes to what we're doing and then enhance it. And ultimately that's going to help. That's going to help patients.
That's really interesting because I was just thinking as you were kind of talking through that, um, as you're developing your scientific narrative and trying to create a compelling story, um, unless you are this, you know, population of clinicians who are caring for these patients, you don't know if you're speaking their language or not speaking their language, but like
Yeah, it
speaking,
is.
if you're reaching them. So, how do you pivot when
Mm.
that happens? If they're like, it's not resonating with me.
Yeah, it can be hard for a couple of different reasons. One is there's momentum to things. There's a time investment and there's a bias towards we've done something, we've made it, and there's some friction to changing. That's the reality. So we have to always work through that. I think it's also really making sure that you're asking the right people,
Mhm.
right? We tend to in medical affairs, sort of we sort of the people that you have relationships with maybe are the top KOLs, right? Now, if you're designing things for them, I think they're a good source of feedback on what they like and don't like and what's resonating with them. But if you're designing a narrative for a broader set of HCPs or stakeholders, right, that maybe have less knowledge about a topic, maybe have less time, have less inherent interest, you really have to actually figure out what those people think. That can be a little bit harder. There's lots of different ways to do it. You can do it through market research. You can do it through advisory boards or consultancies. You can do it through MSL feedback if you really structure it the right way. We call them key insight questions or
Mhm.
surveys, mindset mapping. Um, but if you don't do that and you're not careful about that, you can do a lot of activity and a lot of check boxes, and you can be really proud of yourself that you've done all this. But are you really, again, are you changing belief and are you changing practices appropriately? Um, and that really is the North Star to what we need to be doing in medical affairs. And the good thing is, there's a lot more tools and opportunities to actually measure those things than I certainly had when I was starting off in Canada a number of years ago, where we didn't have any data and we didn't have the money to buy the data. We didn't have the data available. And it was literally like having conversations with people to get feedback. And now we have so many more opportunities that it's sort of like endless data to sift through and make changes using.
And that's actually, I was just about to ask you, like, where do you stand on um, the digital thought leaders or,
Mm.
mining the social media to incorporate that into strategy?
Very, very high. I think, again, when we think about channels and influence, and we think about even just very basic KOL mapping, I think everyone's done this at one point in their career. If you're an MSL or a medical director, and if you don't call it that, it's how much influence does someone have, and do they are they articulating things accurately and appropriately as it relates to our drug or our disease, right? And I think that's really important. And digital thought leaders. So again, this is just for people in the audience. This is people, could be people on Twitter that are, the sort of will take data and then articulate it through social media. This is very important. Um, and they have, of course, a lot of appropriate influence. Usually, they are experts in the field, and as they should be, and they're looked to provide that information and not just, hey, here's an interesting poster, here's an interesting new piece of data, but what's their perspective? So it is important that we know who those people are. We make sure that we're appropriately engaging those people and make sure that they understand our perspective. And if we have the right communication and we have the right perspective, then that should follow through into their communications. And I think that's really, really important.
So you said something earlier, Steve, and I think we've had this conversation before. I'm pretty sure we've had tons of conversations, but you were talking about the idea of understanding if a resource is working appropriately, if those types of things. I think a lot of this, and this is very important for any VPs of medical affairs out there listening, things to consider. When I think one of the gaps that's currently there is when we think about putting together medical affairs goals for a year.
Mm-hmm.
Medical directors typically, sometimes you'll see, okay, create symposia, create two or more publications. For the MSLs, it is moving somebody along a spectrum. Those types of things. From how much influence are you having on your KOLs? And I feel like that is the wrong way to approach it. Number one, we're not thinking about being one group with many functions. We're thinking about individual functions in medical affairs and project management types of things. In that sense, it would be so much better to for the field or whoever to know that they're not being judged. They're not going to be evaluated if they provide the feedback that they've not been able to move somebody along a continuum after utilizing this resource. Now, obviously on the back end, managers can look and see, like, are there any outliers in across the team that I might need to investigate and learn a little bit more. Maybe it's a way that they're communicating things. But if we're putting one thing on of checking a box for one group, but then we're holding a standard of influence on another, it just, you're gonna bias what you get back from the field, because they know it's the whole thing about, like, if you're tracking time, I mean, that can be inherently, that from a thought, it could be great to say, hey, we average 30 minutes a meeting, whatever this is, right? But what if Viva has an option of saying 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, and the meeting was 20 minutes? Do you think an MSL is going to put 15, or do you think they're going to round it up to 30, right? It's always going to be that way, the tyranny of metrics. And so I think we have to, even though these things are subjective in ways, to really understand how you're moving the needle, specifically in the field component of it. You really need to make it as a subjective information as objective as possible. So that's one of those things that have always stood out to me and frustrated me in ways as well too. But we've also seen it work well too, Steve, right? When we set up these insight questions and we do it in that way, to be able to come back and really inform not only medical affairs, but the business at large too, when you remove as much subjectivity in that way as possible. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a challenging problem. It's always how do you measure success or impact in medical affairs, like the big challenge, right? And it is a challenge in some ways, and I think that's, again, because of a whole bunch of reasons that we probably could talk about for an hour. But I think what you said is really important. And the way I think about it, we think again back to this idea of measuring knowledge, attitudes, and practices, right? One of the ways is, of course, the MSL's perspective on those things, right? Which, again, if you can lay them out as cleanly as possible, you can get them to sort of relay their perspective. But that is subjective, and there's biases and there's incentives, right, to sort of move those sort of things, right? And I think that's the reality. So what's important is to have we'll call it like a multimodal approach to this, where you have that, of course, but you also have to have other layers of information. Like I said, ATUs is one thing that can be done, that will allow an external perspective. Other, again, behavioral things that people do, right? What do they say in public, right? What do they say on social media? And then when we look down to practices, maybe not for individuals, of course, because we have limitations and it's appropriate in what we can measure, but we can measure, right, behaviors in terms of systems like time to diagnosis, time to treatment. Those sorts of things can be measured on a practice level, right? And then you can link those three things. And the reason that's important is because a lot of times, to your point, if the goal is what we used to say in medical affairs, I think, for MSLs was build relationships with KOLs, right? So, right, it's sort of a catch-all phrase, right? But almost impossible to measure. And that's why this idea of measuring other things that are measurable is really, really important. And then being able to also be realistic that the knowledge, attitudes, and practices of an individual person or health system or whatever it is, whatever entity we're talking about, isn't solely the responsibility of the field. We just talked about all of the other channels of information, right? It's everything. Everything is contributing to the knowledge, attitudes, and practices of the system and individuals. And as much as medical affairs and MSLs have a strong role to play, it's neither their entire responsibility nor is it their entire success, I guess, to make those changes, because there's a lot of other information out there that and tactics that we're using. And that's when we think about the medical director part of it, that's kind of what my job is to have all of those things sort of in an omni-channel perspective to make sure that that things are moving in the right direction.
So Steve, I think that there's a practical example that comes to mind, and I would love for you to share it. It really puts a couple pieces together, talking about the scientific narrative that you were referencing a second ago, and then assessing knowledge, attitudes, and practices in the sense of really being able to communicate a meaningful story with the data and being able to adjust. And I think that, if I recall, I'd love for you to share maybe a light bulb moment that you had, or you can even talk about ways from your experience how you've shifted your philosophy of communicating versus the traditional way. So tell the listeners a little bit, if you will.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think so. I think a really good example of this, is the launch of a drug that we've recently launched. And I think generally when you launch a product, you kind of you're launching the product, but you're also in medical, you're launching the study a little bit. You're launching the phase 3 pivotal study, right? There's, again, back to sort of biases and where people are coming from. Years and years of work has been put into these studies, right? So I think it's very natural to sort of, uh, present the drug and present the data in the context and structure of a study, right? Primary results, secondary results, exploratory results. And we sort of move through those processes. And sometimes that can be very effective. And that can be the sort of framework that you talk about your data in perpetuity, because the story works. I think, in the example that we've recently had, here at Alnylam, as much as that was very successful at launching sort of the drug in the study, in terms of sort of the scientific narrative and how people are understanding our study, understanding the data, and understanding it in the context of the physiology of the disease, we actually realized we had to totally flip the script, right? And move to a model where we don't just look at how the study was designed, but really, how do people think about the mechanism of disease? How do they think about what's happening to people with this disease? And then how does that then biologically reflect what we see in our study? And we put the data into that framework instead of keeping it at a study. And what we ended up doing is we ended up designing this sort of, we'll call it interactive resource, where the MSLs are able to sort of dive into the data from a high level story, click through into specific sections in response to questions or sort of, again, knowledge, attitudes, and practice gaps, and then move through. And that's something that we kicked off a few months ago. The MSLs have been out in the field with it. They've been getting a lot of feedback. And, as I said, we're now doing version 2, and it will be version 3 and version 4 and version 5. And we're not gonna, I think, change the whole thing again. But I think this sort of tweaking to make sure that we're clearly communicating, right, and making an impact on, again, attitudes and practices or beliefs and actions.
So I have a question that I don't feel like we kind of addressed. And I think it's a really interesting one. So you started your career as a country MSL, and today, fast forward, you are leading strategy for 2 countries. Is that right?
Right now, just the U.S., but yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just assumed that they let you have the homeland too, but no.
I tried, but you know what? It was too much work. Back to this idea, you can't do everything yourself, right? It was too much work.
Yeah, actually, that was one of my things I was going to ask is, from country to country, things are so different. Regulations are so different, and even the way providers approach care to their patients. Like in some countries, the patients don't really get involved in telling their doctors how they're going to be treated. But here in the United States, they will tell you, I don't want to take that, give me that. So anyway,
Yeah.
just as an example. But so what sort of learnings did you have to, if any? And, as a second question onto that, for anybody who is looking to move from one country to another and take on different regulations, what advice would you have?
Yeah. There's a lot of learnings, and I think I would say, just to back it up to sort of a more generalized situation, I think you're going in from one framework of situation to something very different, and you have to sort of appreciate what's the connective tissue between these two things, and what can I bring with me, and what do I have to jettison and unlearn to make room to relearn
Mm,
a new thing and a new regulations, paradigm, framework, way of working, right? So I think this is sort of generally applicable. So I'll give a couple examples. So I think one of the interesting things between Canada and the US is actually the kind of perspective on care of physicians. When you get right down to it, when they're sitting in front of their patients and having a conversation, it's not that different. It's not that different. It's very, very similar, right? Um, Part of it is, I think the sort of learning and like culture between the countries is quite similar. A lot of the medical training, if you think of conferences in the US and everything, Canadians come to the US for conferences, Americans come to Canada for international conferences. So there's just a lot of mixing. Taking out the reimbursement part is really I think the only major difference between the countries, but there are differences in regulations, right? There's no direct to consumer advertising in Canada. So I think, to your
mm.
point, I think unless you're watching American television, which everybody does, so then you still see the Ozempic commercials, on television. So it's not like we're insulated from that. So I do think there's maybe a little bit more paternalistic care in Canada, and maybe a little less of that sort of autonomy for patients, or sort of culture for patients to sort of advocate for their own care, as there is in the US. But it's not that different. But it's in terms of some other things, I think the US is just a lot bigger than Canada. I mean, it's going to sound stupid, but it's 10 times bigger, right? So one of the interesting things, coming from a relatively small company, but also coming from a small team, you could sit in a room, which we did when I first came to Long Island. I didn't tell that story as much as I was the only Canadian employee, had to build a medical affairs affiliate, and we had 6 months to launch our first drug, with basically started from scratch, right? But we were able to get our entire team at the time of launch, which was 8 people, in a room, and write down the entire country, all the centers of excellence, exactly the strategy we're going to apply to each one, right? All agree, communicate, and then execute, right? So the friction to execution is very low in that situation, because you have very few people, you have very few decision makers. So that's and less complexity, right? You have less opportunity when it comes right down to it. You can't do that in the US. You can't sit down in a room and look at every single site, every single KOL, every single institution in a meeting, and just sort of map it out and have everyone leave that meeting with complete clarity of intent, right? So I think that inherent opportunity in the US, because of the market size, because of the dynamics, because of everything that makes the US amazing in terms of sort of the pharmaceutical market, is also inherently challenging, right? And that complexity creates a different skill set that you have to learn. And that was certainly, for me, I'm not going to say a fish out of water, but it was something that was very different from what I've experienced in my career. So I have to adapt to that. Maybe still am. But you learn a lot. And it's also being able to also trust, I think, that other people have other roles to play, and you don't have to, when you're a smaller team, you're a little more of a jack of all trades, master of none, right? You have to kind of think about almost all the dynamics at the same time and keep them in your head. A little less so when you're in a bigger company and a bigger team. Those people have it. Those people have it. I need to focus on what I need to do. And as a team, we're rowing in the same direction.
Well, I mean, the thing about challenge is if it's not challenging, it's boring.
It's very, it's very boring. And I'll say
right?
that's the other thing. I was going to say one of the reasons that I decided to leave my previous company was I learned a lot. This was the company that I grew into a medical director and was head of the organization in Canada. Um, but it was great company. I learned a lot. A little bit of a long tail, a little slower pace. I wasn't, my acceleration of learning wasn't there. So that's another piece for your career is,
Mhm.
you know, if you're feeling like you're not learning and you're not sort of elevating yourself, you don't have opportunities to improve, do it in your own role. You don't need another role to do it, but always be pushing towards excellence, always be pushing towards learning something new. And that will put you in a position again to be that person on the board that it's a no-brainer. It'll build your skill set. It'll let you know what you're interested in and not interested in. And it will prepare you. So when you do get that role, you're not pulling your hair out, scared to death that in having imposter syndrome 24 hours a day. It'll only be 12 hours a day, and you'll be absolutely okay.
So I know we're getting close to wrapping up. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off, Chaz. Okay. Okay.
You're fine.
So I mean, a lot of the things that you kind of talked about, I really, really enjoyed, if you can't tell. But I hear a lot of like, maybe this guy's got a crystal ball. So what are you excited about for the future? Like maybe
Yeah.
it's not AI, maybe it is AI, but what are you excited for the future of roles like what you're in right now? What should we
Yeah.
be expecting and getting
No,
ready
I
for?
think it's interesting you say AI because I think that is always the sort of right now it's such a huge question mark in terms of sort of how that's going to affect all of our lives. I was thinking all these podcasts and things will date themselves in the next 4 or 5 years. Just like when you look back now at podcasts that were done during COVID and everyone's talking about masks and not being able to go to the
Mm,
grocery store. Right. In 5 or 6 years, we'll be looking back at these podcasts where people are talking about AI and it'll probably think it's a little bit funny. So definitely how we use, I would say information. To me, it's this idea of scalability of information and really multiplying our effect, right? And AI can absolutely do that, right? AI can multiply the effect of how do we take a whole bunch of very complex information, collate it and simplify it to give us ideas to move something forward much quicker. That is an amplifying effect, right? Um, and taking that kind of concept and working with the structures that allow for that scalability and just really leaning into that. So I think, I'll give a concrete example. Just working with medical societies, right, as industry, whether it's one company or multiple companies, to really make sure that the infrastructure is there, maybe the financial support is there to really move the needle on like consistent and sort of evolving education, right? And it's not just a free for all where, you know, there's 10 CMEs that say the same thing and no one's really progressing, right, in terms of their knowledge, right? Because that's very easy to happen. It can be very uncoordinated. That's the kind of thing that is activity and doesn't actually move the needle. So it's getting really good at identifying those things, getting more data and more focus on it. And that's kind of where I'm excited, I guess, for the next phase of things. That's something that we're really focused on our team.
I would even add to that as being able to measure the things that we've done. I mean, for years, right? You just said one of the biggest challenges for medical affairs is really truly understanding the impact that's being made. You can certainly control about what you put out, but how do you know if it's being translated into practice and like care gap analysis, those types of things, being able to look at change in prescription or prescription claims across the class, diagnosis rates, as you mentioned earlier, utilizing a certain test at a faster rate, those types of things, we can actually be able to indirectly say, hey, we were part of that journey now. So, I mean, there's different things with those tools that you just mentioned that we haven't been able to do in the past. And it also puts us in a vulnerable place within industry as well, too, when things get a little tougher maybe in the industry, et cetera? What are the value of our organization? Do we need to make cuts, et cetera? Is it going to be here where you can actually now say, look, here is the impact, and you can see it more tangibly than ever before. So I think that's what excites me the most about the potential for that, similar to what you just said. So any closing thoughts before we wrap up, Steve?
I've really, other than just really enjoying this conversation, it's not often that you get to sort of reflect on your own career journey, on sort of what it means to make these choices and sort of where you ended up. So I guess I just really appreciate it. Just to sort of bring it back to just to reiterate the key takeaways, I guess, as we always should do at the end of every presentation, is, make sure people walk away with some actions and some takeaways. So it's, again, really thinking about moving from an individual contributor, right, to a higher level, more enterprise level thinking, using the skills you're building and influencing and translating data into understanding, into belief. Use that to build your network, to create belief in others, to create influence in others, and to lead. And then, again, thinking about how to take your energy, which you only have so much, and you can bang your head against a wall trying to do something just yourself, but take that time and see what you can do to amplify your efforts and scale your efforts through others or through channels that are going to be, again, ultimately make the most impact for your own career, for the company or the patients that you're serving.
You heard it here, folks, from one of my good friends, and I've learned a lot over the past year and a half from him. Steve, thanks so much for joining us on MSL Lead Chronicles today. Listeners, thanks so much for tuning in. Remember that leaders don't develop in isolation. Leaders learn from leaders. With that, take some of these key takeaways that Steve shared, put them into practice. Shoot us a text or feedback on our page of how they've made impacts. I'm sure Steve would love to hear that too. And until the next time, lead well.